Here we have one of the hottest vehicles of the 1980s. And before you laugh at my statement, just hear me out here. This little Chevrolet X11 Citation was indeed one of the fastest cars of the 1980s. They would go from 0 to 60 in about 8.5 seconds with the manual transmission. And you have to remember that at the time, Corvettes were taking about 8 seconds flat to go from 0 to 60. So you really had a mini Corvette when you bought your Citation X11. But of course, not all Citation X11s are created equal. And we're going to discuss a little bit about the history of the Citation as well as the X11 itself. Now, the X11, the X comes from the X platform, which was introduced by General Motors for the 1980 model year. It was a long model year for 1980 that started kind of in the spring of 1979. And GM would then introduce the Chevrolet Citation, the Pontiac Phoenix, the Olds Omega, and the Buick Skylark. These would comprise General Motors' first front-wheel drive, transversely mounted engine and transmission vehicles that it would produce. Of course, there were front-wheel drive vehicles before this that GM produced: Oldsmobile Tornados, Cadillac Eldorados, Buick Rivieras starting in 1979, but those had longitudinally mounted engines. And here, this was a transversely mounted engine and transmission intended to save up passenger compartment space and really give that back to the passengers, because this was, after all, the era of fuel economy standards. There were corporate average fuel economy standards that had been enacted in the late 1970s, which required the domestic auto manufacturers as well as the foreign manufacturers to produce vehicles that could achieve 27.5 miles per gallon from a corporate fleet average standpoint by the late 1980s. And you have to remember that when these were enacted, the domestic auto companies were generally making large vehicles with big V8s, whereas the Japanese auto companies were already making small vehicles. They really didn't have to do anything to meet the CAFE standards, whereas every single domestic auto manufacturer had to rip up their existing portfolio and redo it over effectively one, at most two model generations, and it significantly overtaxed the engineering staffs. This was something that none of them had done contemporaneously. They had never re-engineered their entire portfolio over such a period of time, and they didn't have any more engineers to do it than they normally did. So it was a very significant undertaking. Now, as I said, the Citation was introduced in 1980 along with the X cars, and it was a huge success in that inaugural model year. 800,000 Citations were sold in the 1980 model year alone. 800,000, enough for 3 plants to be operating full-time, round-the-clock, 3 shifts per day. And that's just the Citation alone. There was the Phoenix, which was also a significant seller, the Omega and the Skylark. Now, unfortunately, these were also some of the most, let's say, trouble-prone vehicles that were ever produced. I think they may have even been the most recalled cars to date, surpassing the Aspen and Volare, which had been the most recalled cars to date up until that point. But they really were the right car for the right time, and it's a shame because they had, let's just call it 95%, at least 90 to 95% of what was needed correct. It was unfortunately that remaining 5 to 10% that would really end up doing them in, and the Citation sales would fall from 800,000 in 1980 to basically be cut in half every year thereafter, down to 400,000, 200,000. Chevrolet tried to reintroduce the Citation as the Citation II to kind of convey to potential buyers that things had changed, but nobody was really convinced. And once the A-bodies came out in 1982, that would be the Chevrolet Celebrity, the Pontiac 6000, the Olds Cutlass Sierra, as well as the Buick Century. That really ate into the X-car sales because those were effectively a little bit longer X-cars. And then the N cars, when they were introduced in 1985, the Olds Calais, the Buick Somerset, and the Pontiac Grand Am, that was it for the X-car run. After 1985, they were all gone. But back to this particular copy, this 10,000 or 11,000 mile 1982 Chevrolet Citation X11. Now, what was so special about this? Well, the X11 was effectively a sporty Citation. It was a dress-up package, more or less, in 1980. You still had the standard engine. You could even get the 90 horsepower Iron Duke 4-cylinder in your X11 underhood. And you got a few extra stickers and stick-on items, and that was about it. A few little suspension upgrades for the 1980 model year. But in 1981, the X11 would really become a hot vehicle for buyers, and that was because there were a significant amount of new components. And if you take a look at the photo here, you'll see the litany of those components that were unique to the X11. Springs and shocks and stabilizer bars, and even the engine itself, as well as the clutch, was unique to the X11. And in this particular model year, 1981, which many would argue is the best year for the X11, the high output V6 was making 135 horsepower and generating 165 pound-feet of torque, the most that it would ever have in the Citation X11. And the standard in 1980 60-degree V6 was generating 115 horsepower. So 135, 20 more horsepower, about 20% more power, that's quite a bit. And don't chuckle at 135 horsepower being high output. That was high output for the time. If you were braking, I would say 125 horsepower, you were doing pretty well. And these cars are quite light. They weigh in the upper 2,000s of pounds, like 2,700 pounds or so. So that's how you get relatively good acceleration from just 135 horsepower. Now, before we get into more of the technical details, let's take a look at this Redwood Metallic 1982 X11. This car was sold on Bring a Trailer, and it's up for sale again not that long thereafter. I think maybe a year after it's sold on Bring a Trailer. So this is a pretty sweet one because, as I said, it has about 11,000 original miles, and it's a 1982, which is not a bad year for the X11. The horsepower output was the same at 135 horsepower, but the torque rating had decreased from 165 down to 145, really because of emissions. And it would kind of go down each year thereafter. Even the final year of the X11 in 1985, when it would get fuel injection, it would be 130 horsepower. So, well, I guess the carbureted 1981 version is the best if you don't mind putting up with an electronic feedback carburetor. But here you can see, let's just call it the packaging and the efficient shape of the 1982 Citation X11. And you have a number of very typical GM styling cues of the era. This was a car that was, let's say, designed in the so-called sheer look of styling, relatively boxy, relatively angular, but you have the very low belt line. Notice how big the door glass is, as well as the rear quarter glass is absolutely huge on this vehicle. So you do have an open and airy cabin, toothpick A-pillars, very thin roof. You don't see these thin roofs really on cars anymore because of the rollover standards. The roofs are pretty thick and chunky on, doesn't really matter what vehicle that you have today. You also have a relatively thin C-pillar back there too. So the upper portion of this car looks kind of light and airy, and if you're sitting in it, you have great visibility and sight lines all around you, which is excellent, something that cars today don't have, and that's why you have to have blind spot monitoring systems, because the pillars are so thick and the roof is so thick, you can't really see out of the vehicle. But you have that low belt line, as I mentioned, that kind of crests upward at the end there to form a point as the daylight opening, that graphic on the rear quarter window, comes down from the roof. I think that's an attractive looking overall design. And you have a bit of a gentle rise to the fender profile as it starts near the turn signal. And notice how it kind of rises just very subtly up until the point where it meets the A-pillar. Now, if we take a look at the body side, here's a close-up of that. And I wanted to show this because I think it shows that despite the fact that some people will pick on the styling of the car, there are some details that you can tell the designers really sweated on this vehicle. Look, for instance, at this area here where there's the filleted concave surface that then transitions into the apex of a radius, that kind of sharp crease that forms not only a portion of the wheel arch, but also really a surface on the rest of the vehicle. Look how fat it is on the area ahead of and behind the wheel arch, where the body sits proud at the lower section of the upper portion of the body. And that gives the car a little bit more dramatic stance, makes it look a bit wider in the right places, and helps the tires kind of fill out the body. So I would just say on this Redwood Metallic car, you can see the light and how it catches that fillet, the top portion of the surfacing. And I think it's a beautiful detail before you have this sharp crease. So you've got a relatively dull fillet and then a very sharp crease that kind of contrast against one another. And you have the so-called frame, that surface on the lower section of the body that, again, gives this car a bit better stance. And I think that this is a beautiful detail on this X11 Citation. By the way, each of the X cars would have different detailing for the wheel arches as well as the body sides, despite the fact that they basically look very similar. But take a look at that and look on my channel for a video that explains how much of these vehicles is actually different in terms of styling. There's a lot more differences than similarities, but you just don't see it at first glance. You really have to look at the cars, and then you will discover that. Now, in this photo, it's not in the sunlight, so you can't quite see the details that I was showing before, but you can look at the reflections of the body side, and you can see how that fillet beautifully distorts the reflection, especially around the wheel arch, and gives the car some dimension, despite the fact that the surfacing is relatively simple. Now, as we look at the back, and particularly the back glass, one detail that I like is notice how the lower edge of the back glass is almost a continuation of a line, if you were to construct a line between that and the point of the rear quarter glass. It's not higher, it's not lower. It's almost as though somebody took the edge of the rear quarter glass and that point and then moved a line around the side of the vehicle, and that would be where the back glass stopped. And I think that gives it some beautiful symmetry just in the glass itself. You also have the so-called duckbill spoiler for the X11. I don't think that this was really helping reduce the lift in the rear or generate downforce in the rear. It's probably more aesthetic than anything. And these cars probably topped out at about 120 miles per hour or something like that, maybe a little less than that, especially with the short final drive ratios, probably in the 100 and teens, maybe 110 to 115 or so. So wasn't a huge issue. And you have the blacked out B-pillars and blacked out trim. The blacked out B-pillar at least helps visually kind of make that daylight opening one graphic, as opposed to, imagine if that were painted or chromed, it would visually separate the B-pillar and the front glass from the rear quarter glass. Pretty good looking 14-inch wheels on this X11 as well. Many of the X cars had 13-inch wheels, and even the X11 did in 1980 when it was a dress-up car, as I call it. That 1980 X11 even had a stick-on air vent, which you can see here was terrible, but that was gone, thankfully, by this point, and the car actually had some relatively good looks. And as we rotate around to the front end, we can see the blacked out grille and all the blacked out trim on this particular vehicle. Not only the grille, but the windshield reveal moldings, as well as the A-pillar trim, that B-pillar, as I mentioned, giving the car kind of a menacing look and an authoritative look for something that was really just starting out as a family hatchback. These cars did have a lot of room inside them. There's not even a Chevrolet badge up front to denote that this is your Citation, although there is a pretty dramatic hood bulge that you can see there, and these cars did have functional cowl induction. So, yeah, they kind of went back into the yesteryear portfolio and had cowl induction on the Citation X11s. It probably helped a little bit, but I think it was a little bit more gimmicky than anything else. Now let's rotate around to the interior, and here we have the Redwood interior to match the exterior, kind of a dipped car overall, the same exterior and interior colors, and I think it really fits the car. These bucket seats, one thing I love about the X11s as well as cars of the 80s is that, you know, this car, you can tell it's got some lateral support. There's a little bit of bolstering there, not as much as you'd have in a modern day car. It's not going to keep you as glued into your seat. Of course, these cars didn't handle as well as modern vehicles either. But these seats were actually comfortable, and I don't know what's happened. Seats these days just aren't very comfortable. The X cars in general had great seat comfort. My 84 Oldsmobile, it has a front bench seat, and I love it. It is so comfortable for long trips. Everything's just about perfect on it, from the contouring of the seat to the stiffness of the foam. You just don't get that anymore. Maybe my Buick LaCrosse is not too bad, but Many vehicles aren't great. You can also tell this car has the automatic transmission. It does have air conditioning, has the comfort tilt steering wheel, and the center console, or the consolette, shall we say, because it's not a full-length center console. Now, when you got your Citation X11, you did get that steering wheel that says X11 in the middle. You got a full complement of gauges, everything from a tachometer to a voltmeter to an oil pressure gauge to an engine temperature gauge, so you could tell what was happening under hood. The Citations during these years, interestingly, had the vertically oriented radio, which you can see to the right of the gauges, as well as vertically oriented HVAC controls. And this wouldn't be the first time that there was a vertically oriented radio. Of course, Corvettes in the 1960s had that, but maybe the first time in the 1980s era on GM cars that you would see that. Some people thought it was okay. I think most people didn't care for it. And GM, I don't think they would replicate a vertically oriented radio after the X car. I can't think of a GM car that has one. If I'm in error, please put a comment in the comment section. You do have a little bit of the driver-centric cluster here that wraps around the driver. And notice the gear shift lever for the transmission. For those who are fans of Knight Rider, you might recognize that as the same gear shift from KITT. That is indeed the gear shift that was employed across General Motors on a number of vehicles, including the 1982 Trans Ams. Here's a close-up of that gauge cluster. You can see this car's 10,652 miles on it. It's a bit of a shame that it's not a manual transmission and it's an automatic. I think it would be a more desirable collector car if it had a manual. But hey, you can't go down to your Chevrolet dealership and order one of these anymore. So you kind of got to go with what you can get. And this one appears to be in great shape underneath as well as under hood and on the interior. These cars did not necessarily last that long. They had quite a few problems. I mentioned it was, I believe, the most recalled car in history to its point. Everything from the steering racks would get morning sickness, which, by the way, the seller says that he has replaced on this car. I'm not surprised. The steering racks were issues. The door handles would break. The window regulators, which were tape drive mechanism, would break. Interestingly, you crank these in the opposite direction of normal. If you want to lower the window, you're rotating the crank counterclockwise as opposed to clockwise. If you want to raise the window glass, you're going in a clockwise direction. So it's not quite intuitive. I don't know why GM did that with the window regulators on these, but hey, they did. And here's that vertically oriented radio and HVAC setup. I take that back. I can think of at least a vertically oriented HVAC setup, and that would have been on the S10 pickups and the Chevrolet Astro GMC Safari vans. So I can think of that. The vertically oriented radio, I'm still scratching my head on one that would come after this. But as I said, most people didn't necessarily care for it. It's a little bit counterintuitive, and I think the gear shift lever interfered with your reach on these a little bit. So that wasn't necessarily the best design. But hey, it was the 80s. And overall, I would say the ergonomics on these cars really aren't too bad. The seat comfort is awesome. Now let's go under hood. And you see this has the high output 60-degree V6. Woo, the 135 horsepower, 2.8 liter V6 engine. This was introduced and engineered for the X cars and the 1980 model year. You can see even the cowl induction there, where it would take air in from that hood bulge. Now, this 60-degree V6 would last for many, many years, and it would keep getting larger and larger. It started out its life as 2.8 liters. It would become 3.1 liters, 3.4 liters, 3.5 liters, and at the end, even there was a 3.9 liter. All were generated off of this particular engine family and this particular engine, but this is where it all started. This 2.8 liter would be used in many different GM vehicles of the era, including the Fieros. And I have to say that I'm not a fan of the carburetors on these, the electronic feedback carburetors, but once they got fuel injection, this little 2.8 was a very pleasant engine, and it made great noises. It revved relatively high for a pushrod engine. You could rev it to 5,500 RPM, no problem, even a little north of that, although it was running out of gas past that point. And it sounded good, I would say. So it was a pleasant engine. It kind of got increasingly less pleasant as the engine got larger and larger. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. But you notice here you have the air pump that's behind the air conditioning compressor, the big GM Pancake R4 air conditioning compressor. And this one appears to be pretty clean. You can tell there's also cruise control. The cruise control transducer there is on the driver's side. I guess this car must have been undercoated or something, hence why It's black under hood here as opposed to being body color, which was pretty typical for the time and probably helped save this from rust. But as I mentioned, 1982 was not a bad year for these X11 engines. They still made the 135 horsepower. They did have a little less torque than the 1981 model year, but still a good engine overall, so long as you're putting up with that electronic feedback carburetor. Well, and there we have the story of the 1982 X11. And if you want this one, it was originally sold, I think, by Competition Cars. Competition Cars, and Bill has some great classic vehicles. I don't know how he finds all these low mileage classics. I think he just has a reputation now, and people contact him to sell theirs. I wish they would contact me. I would buy more, but he often has great vehicles to sell and then sells them on Bring a Trailer. So be on the lookout, and you can even check out his YouTube channel, Competition Cars. I don't know Bill, but certainly respect him and respect what he does in terms of selling the vehicles that he does. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, take care.